Welcome to the People Strategy Forum podcast, where we're diving deep into the culture of overwork. Its impact on our daily lives as employees and organizations. And this is super important for your leaders out there to make sure that we're really balancing things. So that we're going to talk about that and dive deep into that today. But joining us is Brigid Schulte. She's a renowned author and journalist and the director of the Better Life Lab. So Brigid brings her wealth of experience from her time at the Washington Post, where her contributions were part of a Pulitzer Prize winning team. To her, it includes her those important insights that she's going to be talking about today, and how she helps leaders and on the complexities of modern life and how to really have that balance internally. So through her work, Brigid challenges the status quo, advocating for transformative change that aims to improve and balance work, love, and play. So join us as we explore the actionable strategies for reshaping work environments to foster a healthier and more fulfilling work life overall. So welcome, Brigid. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So, as we kind of jump into things here, I want to make sure that we are, really look a little bit in how you came about helping the people that you help today. So, would you mind just taking us through your journey of how you got into becoming a journalist and really focusing on this particular niche?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how far back you want me to go, but I grew up in Oregon. I love Oregon. I love it's beautiful out there, but it also rains a lot. And so I grew up reading a lot as a kid and just was really taken by stories, fiction, nonfiction, learning about other people's lives. And I think early on, I wanted to be part of that, somehow be part of learning and sharing what you learn. And I think I was reading George Plimpton, and he went and he played football. I'm like, I want to do that. And then he went with the hot air ballooning. And I thought, what a great profession. You can kind of step in and out of you can try on a lot of different things and then share what
Right.
you've learned. So early on, I was very taken by stories and storytelling. And um, I sort of fell into journalism a little bit by accident. And it was really something that, I always thought I would sort of make up stories or fiction. And boy, it is so true. Like real life is stranger than fiction. I mean, people's stories are amazing, what they've been through in their lives. And I found myself really drawn to real events and real stories and what people were going through. And um, uh, there's this one phrase that I came across that I absolutely love. It's anonymous. I'm not sure who said it, but it says the shortest distance between two people is a story. So I love how stories connect us. They're ways that we find what is common, in all of us and our yearnings and what we want out of life. It's a reminder of how short our lives are, and we can often lose that and forget about that. So for me, stories sort of keep me very grounded in kind of the why are we here? What's the
Yeah.
what are our lives like? So um, I started my career in journalism, worked for a number of different newspapers. I've written magazine stories. Wound up at the Washington Post, and I like to say I started when my son was about 8 months old, and I left when he was 6'4". So I was there for some time. Learned a lot, wrote for a lot of different sections. Wrote my first book based on my experience there, where I was really trying to combine, a very meaningful but also very demanding career with trying to be a mother and really caring about having that time for family and just really struggling and feeling like I wasn't doing it very well. And then everybody I talked to is like, well, nobody's doing it well. And so it was sort of limping along, and then really kind of wanted to look into that. Like, why do we accept that? Why is that okay? And why is it mainly falling on women? And what is that? How did we get here? And can we change? And that really led to my first book, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. That really looks at gender roles and modern life and time pressure. found all sorts of fascinating research about time use research, which I didn't even know existed. So I learned a lot, and there was so much I wanted to share. And then really, once I finished that book, I became so convinced that so much of what drives overwhelm and busyness and a lot of misery in modern life is centered in our work culture, that there is an overwork ethic that has developed in recent years. We've gone from hard work to kind of super overdoing it, hard work,
Mhm.
and it shows up in different ways. For knowledge workers, there's an expectation to overwork in one job. The ideal worker, the more hours you put in, the more rewards you get, and that's held up by evidence. That's what we reward, even though it may not be the best performance, but that's sort of the thinking. And then for gig workers, or low wage workers or hourly workers, the jobs have, I call it the crapification of work. So many jobs no longer support human life.
Mhm.
And so then people are really struggling to combine several different jobs or jobs and side hustles and gigs. And so people are overworking for different reasons on different sides of the socioeconomic spectrum, but the costs and the consequences on our lives are enormous. Also on our civic life, the fabric of our society. People talk about deaths of despair and they think about opioids, and I often think about our work culture, because people don't have time to care for themselves or be with family. That work is sort of eating us alive in a way. And so I really wanted to look at how we got here, but more importantly, and the same thing I did with the first book, and really part of my philosophy at the Better Life Lab, where I'm now the director of the Work Family Justice Program, Gender Equity Program, really look for solutions. Who's doing it better? What can we learn? So really understand deeply where we are and how we got here, but where can we go? And I try to look at change both in the kind of the personal transformation level, because let's face it, I'm looking for that myself, from personal transformation to looking at organizational change, leadership change, and then looking at the larger kind of public policy, cultural norms, sort of looking at change on those three levels. So both of the books really do that. They're the Overwork that just came out. The first couple of chapters are tough, but stick with it because the rest of them are really about change agents. But I really wanted people to understand that it's systems that you have to look at. Particularly in the United States, we tend to think, oh, if you're overworked, if you're burned out, it's your fault. You just need to set better boundaries, or you should take a bath, or, a bubble bath at night. And there is an element to that. There's always sort of a personal element. I don't want to dismiss that, but that is not the only thing we need to be looking at. A lot of it is the systems that we have at work, our workload. Have we right-sized do we have enough people to do the work that we've outlined? So
Right.
there's an awful lot of things that we can change. And I guess the last thing I'd say is kind of, who are you? Why are you doing this? I would say that I'm really passionate about figuring out how everyone can have access to living a good, full, and wholehearted life.
Right.
Not just a lucky few, not just like a handful of billionaires, but all of us. How can we create the systems that do that, the public policy that does that, the cultural norms that do that, our own personal mindsets and expectations? Really, how can that all work together so that we can live meaningful, fair, equitable, and wonderful, full lives?
Yeah, so many things that we need to talk about today during this discussion based on that, because you're hitting on a lot of points that I know our listeners are very interested in learning more about. But as you've written, I know you wrote Overwhelmed a number of years ago, and then recently and continued the advice with the Overwork. Uh, since you've written these books, how have they transformed the way that leaders have thought about the workplace and really thinking about the health of their workforce? What have you witnessed there?
So I would say, if you're, when you think about sort of the impact that my books are having, from Overwhelmed, I think it's been part of a larger movement, which I think the pandemic really kickstarted, or just really, I shouldn't say kickstarted, but really brought to the fore, which is really an understanding of people and their care responsibilities. There was a Harvard Business School study not long ago that showed that about 75% of all employees identify as having some form of care responsibility. And I
Mhm.
think before that, it was invisible. You were supposed to work as if you didn't have care responsibilities. The ideal worker norms, particularly when you get further up in leadership and the C-suite level, there have been surveys that said, ask, well, who's the best worker? Who's the ideal worker? And many people would say at that leadership level, well, someone with no care responsibilities so that you can devote everything to work,
Mhm.
and so we sort of bifurcated work and life and work and care. And I do feel like my book showed you can't do that, that all of us have care responsibilities, even if it's caring for ourselves. We do get sick. We're not machines.
Mhm.
And how critical that is. It is not an accommodation for a lesser worker, but when you think about the fullness, the wholeness of a human being, we often say, bring your whole self to work. I think a lot of leaders don't mean it,
Yeah.
but when you really do, and you recognize that when people have rich and complex lives, when there are care responsibilities, and they're rich and complex people, you bring that to your work, and it makes your work more fuller, you're more innovative. Believe me, you want to get something done, you talk to a busy mother,
Yes.
and there's research that shows that incredibly productive, but they're not going to be able to put in the longer hours. And so then, oftentimes women or people with care responsibilities will get punished for that and think, well, you're not here until 11, so you can't be a good worker, rather than like looking around at the other end. Well, what are you producing? What impact are you having?
Mhm.
And so I think that that's really an important thing that my next book is doing, is really, if the first one is bringing care to the fore, this next book is showing you how you can do it and how it's better for everyone, for human beings, for workers and employees, also leaders, and your own well-being, your own life. But it also makes the work better, because what it does is it forces you as a leader to be clearer about what the work actually is. And it is shocking, in the reporting that I've done, how many organizations don't really know that, and how many
Mhm.
people aren't really sure what their work is. And so then we're measuring with an old kind of factory standard of long hours as sort of the way we measure productivity, when what we really need to do, and it's harder to do, but we really need to think in a much different way about what productivity means in a modern environment.
Right. Well, before you get too far away from the original topic of caregiving, I want to revisit that because I think that's a big topic today, with a lot of leaders are facing because of the return to work initiative. In COVID, we have a lot of remote work. Not a lot of leaders are wanting people to return to the office, and what's happened is during those times of remote work, people have developed a lifestyle to where they're spending more time with family and supporting their children and so forth. And now going back to the office is putting a strain on that. So, what do you typically advise leaders in that particular scenario of that return to work and how to maintain work-life balance?
Well, two things very quickly. I will say it's not return to work, because people are already working. They're
Yeah,
just working in
good
different
point.
places.
Yeah, that's
So it's really return to office. And I think
right.
that's something to be really clear about. There's an awful lot of work that has been done, and done very well, in a whole bunch of different places, just not at the office in recent years. And actually, for a long time, I worked that way for a long time before it was sort of considered okay. I just sort of hid, which is nuts. The story that I was part of, that won the Pulitzer, I wrote at my kitchen table. You know what I mean? It's like you
Mhm.
can be
Yeah.
incredibly productive, and you don't have to be sitting at a desk in an office. So I think that's one thing to think about. The other thing is, we use the word remote, remote workers. Again, that implies that the real work is done in a place. And that
Mhm.
if you're somewhere else, you are like a satellite, you are kind of spinning off in your own orbit. And I really like to think about using words like digital or networked, because then there's no one central place that work has to be done, that all of that work is valued. Okay, so that said, just sort of around language, thinking about digital work or networked work, and returning to an office. What the research shows is that, across a variety of industries, and a variety of different kinds of companies and businesses, when you look at who's most effective, where are people sort of feeling the greatest job satisfaction, they tend to be a hybrid. So you have some time where you come together. That is important. Human beings, we are incredibly social. There is a real value in having in-person time together to build culture, to build those bonds. It's not the only way to build bonds. So there are fully digital companies that have figured this out. So I don't want to say that, you have to like ditch that if that's working for you. But every company needs to figure out what works best for them, for what they do and who they have. What those care responsibilities are. Fully return to office. I think that what you find is a lot of companies using that as like a soft layoff, that a lot of people are like, if you do that, it's going to make people so angry, they're going to walk. And we've seen that. And I think the danger with that as a leader is that you don't know who's going to do that. And typically it's going to be your higher performer who has the ability. And you have to really ask yourself then, is that do you want to lose control like that? And do you want to just see who's left? Or do you really want to build the team that you need to get your job done? And so when you look at, okay, so how do you do that then? How do you go for, a hybrid setting that would really work? And so I've looked at work redesigns from before the pandemic. I've got a chapter of that in the book. I've looked at the COVID experiments, like what did we learn during all of those experimentation? And then also looked at the short work hours movement, like who on earth is like figuring out how to do less, do the same amount of work in less time. And what I would say is that everybody comes up with different solutions, but the process in all of those instances, in COVID experiments, in work redesigns, in short work hours, the process is the same. And anybody can do it, whether it's an individual, a team leader, a manager, an organizational leader. And the first step is just sort of like to take a big, deep breath and stop.
Yeah.
And then begin to ask, okay, what is our work? What is most important? And get real clear on that. And then what I've seen happen in the most successful cases is you turn it down to like individual teams closest to the work. You turn it over to them and say, figure it out. How are we going to work a 4-day work week? How are we going to handle everybody's care responsibilities and the work that we have to do at different times? When do we need to be together? When are we better? And what should we be doing when we're apart? And really at that, turning the power, giving the power sort of at that lower local level, coming up with something and then experimenting with it, gathering data, having conversations, being transparent, like what's working, what's not, let's tweak it, and then having transparency. So it's the trust and transparency all throughout the organization. Those are the places that really have made huge difference, real changes in how they work, much higher job satisfaction. And I will tell you, and the conversation we had before this, one of the key elements that I have found in all of these processes, what is almost more important than the evidence is whether the leaders believe it will work, and will invest in the process. And then not only that, but then will also try to model that themselves. So leaders and leadership mindset, I think that was one of the most surprising things in the reporting I did for this book. And I worked on it for 10 years. I've been doing an awful lot of reporting. And to find that was sort of like that simple, it's not that simple, but it's a definable process you can go through. And that the power of leadership mindset was really astounding to me. So if there's a lot of leaders out there, you have a lot of power, maybe more than you recognize, to set policy, to set culture, and to really make change.
So let's dive into that a little bit more, because I know that the concept of mindset. But the first thing, as you mentioned, is that you were saying that really with working. What we need to do in the workplace is first understand the job that needs to be done, or the outcome that needs to happen, making sure that we're tracking metrics, right? So that we know when work is being performed, regardless of where it is, and it's deriving to results, right? So I think that's the important thing that leaders need to change their mindset on is measuring just not you know, whether they're seeing a person in sitting in an office chair, but actually measuring results, right? So that's what's
Yeah.
the concept.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but the next piece, I think this is also a mindset shift on employee sides as well, because often when we find that employees, when they say, okay, well, I've given is more flexibility to be able to do work where I think I do it best. Maybe that's at home, maybe it's at a co-working place, or maybe it's in the office. But then they feel like now I'm given this freedom. I need to demonstrate that I'm moving the needle in
Mm.
these metrics, and so they end up working much harder at home, much harder in these the different environments. And so, how can we find this right balance in mindset, not only on the leadership side, but all employees as well?
That's a great question. And the answer is really two parts. What the research shows is that if you are in an ideal worker culture, that values long work hours, that values, kind of like what looks like hard work, which is hours and presence, coming into the office when other people aren't, staying long hours. If you're in an environment where that is rewarded, and you can see they're the people that get promoted, they're the people that the boss recognizes. I can remember being at the Washington Post and having the emails come out. Oh, so and so, they're amazing. They've worked every single weekend the past month. Well, so what's the message that the boss is sending out? Like, you're not a good worker unless you're going to be willing to gift your time back to your employer, your time that you need to recover or spend time with your family. So so in those environments where there is that ideal worker expectation and somebody works digitally or has a flexible schedule, what the research shows is that people will work harder. That was my case. I was working at the Washington Post. I worked very flexibly. I worked very digitally, even when people didn't know, and I worked my rear off because I didn't want to be found out. I wanted to keep my flexibility, and I was grateful. So
Mhm.
the researchers call that the gift theory. That you feel that it's a gift, and so then you have to give back. So this is why it's really important for you to recognize that on your own, but then also, to start challenging those ideal work or cultural norms in your organization. Because part of the reason why you're going to overwork with that flexibility is because that's not seen as the default. It's
Mhm.
not seen as the norm. So the more that we can move toward work cultures and work practices that recognize flexibility with accountability as a default, then the more we're going to be able to cut down on, kind of wicked overwork in a flexible environment.
Great, thank you for that. Now, the next thing that the mind shift that a lot of leaders are facing over the past 5 years is that the workforce has changed from the traditional workforce. I mean, now we have full-time workers, we have part-time workers, we have contingent workers, we have gig workers, and so all this in the desire to have an agile workforce. But then it's caused in some organizations a different treatment upon these different worker groups. For instance, we seem to value the work or value our employees that are providing the work directly before our contingent in gig workers. So how should when we think about a sense of fairness and on a way that we can really uh, help our gig workers out, because a lot of times these are those caregivers that uh, cannot be in an office space, and they need that additional flexibility or freedom to do work when they need to do work in the rest environment. So how should leaders be framing their mindset around this?
Yeah, again, it's such an important question. Um, you can see what's happened over the last several decades. Fewer and fewer W-2 employees. And you say it's all in the service of sort of being lean efficiency, lean and mean, agile workforce. But a lot of it, it's wreaked havoc on the lives of people. We've got so much more precarity in all of our employment that it's really causing enormous problems with stress, with health issues. There's research that shows that not only are layoffs really bad for human beings because it's really hard, and particularly in the United States, we've got a very outdated unemployment insurance system that doesn't train you, doesn't last long enough, doesn't give you enough money, doesn't train you or help you get to the next best thing, like say systems in Germany or other countries do. So it's really tough. And there have been people, I write about it in the book, they're laid off and then they just kind of spiral down. Their health goes, there's higher suicide rates, potentially, work and having a job is key to survival in the United States.
Yeah.
We don't have public policy supports that would help you. Sadly, I mean, I think that we are a real outlier there. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about as a society, whether that's what we want, particularly as we move into a future where there may be less work. So what's going to happen to the humans then? But I think it's important to know that while layoffs are bad for people, they're also, the research shows they're really bad for companies
That's
too.
true.
We think that they're going to get us to the right size or be agile, but what ends up happening is that morale just really tanks. And then people start wondering, am I next?
Mm.
Productivity goes down. And what the research shows is that a year after layoffs, you actually end up needing to hire people because you've lost too many people. And
Mm.
so layoffs have just become kind of a status quo. This is what we're going to do. And so that's what I would really encourage leaders to think long and hard about what is not only the work, but right sizing. Sometimes we think about right sizing as squeezing the labor budget too much. And then where else are you putting the money? You look at these outsized CEO salaries. There was a time when CEOs earned about 30 times what the average worker did. And
Mm.
now it's like up to 300 to 1,000 times more. So you really have to be thinking about what are your values and where do human beings fit in that? Because most researchers will tell you that you're only as good as your people. Your people are your secret weapon, and that's true of any profession. That's like retail. When you look at hourly workers, that's a place where people have just cut their labor budgets to the bone, often kind of from corporate on high directives. And then you get people who walk into a store and you can't find anything, and the sweaters aren't folded and the lines are too long. And so then people leave. And so you can see on your budget, okay, well, labor costs I've controlled those or they're down. But what you can't see are what researchers call future lost sales. When
Mm.
somebody walks out, they're so frustrated, they walk out and they don't spend anything. And then maybe they'll take to social media and badmouth you and say, no, nobody should ever go there.
Mm.
So, I mean, that same kind of thing can happen to any organization when you rely too much on precarious jobs. People can't live like that.
Right.
You really need to be thinking about humans and their human well-being. It's going to make their lives better, but it's also going to make your organization more successful and more sustainable.
So let's revisit the topic of layoffs. And so I know that there's organization. When I think of a layoff, I think that, okay, there's been a misstep of leadership, of managing the business effectively, managing their people, and making sure that they have an agile workforce to stretch with the economy over time. But at times it will happen. So there's a leader that they're facing a layoff, and they have to do more with less. But now of course, their people are impacted. Their people are fearful of future layoffs. Their people are being burdened with even more work that they've had before. Some that they say, well, geez, I couldn't do the job before. How can I do it with even more now? So how should leaders pivot to turn that situation into a success and alleviate some of the stress from their workforce in that scenario?
Yeah, well, I would I would really encourage them to really interrogate, do you really need that layoff,
Mm.
and are you doing it for the right reasons? And if you are, then be really transparent about it. I think the research is so clear, like when you with the return to office stuff or layoffs, if you give people a story, and everybody knows it's not true, it creates moral injury. It creates
Yeah.
more mistrust, distrust. Like a lot of times the return to office is not necessarily to do work better or build culture, which is what leaders will say, but it's because you got some, a whole lot that you're paying in real estate.
Mm.
People know that. And so be real. So I guess that would be the main thing is like be really real, be honest with people. And if you do have to do some kind of layoff or right sizing with the people who are left, this is where I would really encourage people to go through the same kind of process, like they do with the 4-day work week or the COVID experiments or with the work redesigns. Really get clear on the work and then back it up from there. What are your processes that you need to get to the outcome, to the performance, to the impact? Because one of the things that I've found over and over again in my reporting is just how powerful the status quo is.
Hmm.
And how many times people will say, you'll ask, well, why do you do it this way? Why do you have this meeting every week that everybody hates Monday mornings at 9, which makes it really difficult for anybody with care responsibilities to get there? And one person spouts off and everybody's on their phones and everybody hates it. Why do you do this? Well, we've always done it. Well, so there's an awful lot of that. Well, we've always done it this way. And, I spent some time in Iceland where they've made the shorter work hours available to 85% of the workforce. And that was one of the main things that they ran up against. People just sort of like with this mindset, well, we've always done it this way. We can't change. And so that's the first thing that you got to do is just question, let that go. Let that shit go. Excuse my language. Maybe there is a different way to do it. If you are really going to cut that many people, then you owe it to the people who are left to figure out how to do it differently and better.
Mm. Great points. Now, the other thing is that there's the global, well, the global economy, the global demographics is changing. I mean, we're finding some economies and some countries where their workforce is shrinking rapidly. Some of those that we've relied upon, for goods and services, such as China and so forth. So there's a movement of companies kind of nearshoring and looking at their supply chain and bringing jobs closer to home. And they're being forced with looking at ways to increase productivity. And in comes this new technology such as artificial intelligence. And so that brings a relief to some of the problem, and also a big stressor to some others that think that, hey, I might, if I don't up my game and learn this new technology, I may not be relevant in the future. Or how is my job going to change? Am I going to have a job?
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about the stresses and relearning or learning new skills and so forth, how can we kind of change the mindset of our employees so that they are embracing this growth mindset to learn more, to up their game on a daily basis?
Mm, great questions. So the first thing that I would like to do though is really think about why some of these countries, why their workforces are shrinking. You mentioned China, Japan's the same way. They're shrinking because their birth rate is falling.
Mm.
Why is their birth rate falling? For a lot of it is that you look, they have really uh, punishing work cultures. And so then people feel like they have to just give everything to work so that they don't have time for themselves to meet someone, to have a family. There's an awful lot of gender inequality in some of these countries. I have another chapter where it's set in Japan. Um, and that's happening there as well, where you've got these work cultures that are almost impossible to live in. And then, and so then people are just not, they're not finding each other. They're not marrying. They're not, having children. They're not procreating. So there are larger societal issues that we need to be thinking about, that come along with work and care,
Mm.
that come along with really thinking about how we structure our work and how we make room for care and life in our work. So I think that that's a cautionary tale that we need to be thinking about here, as we define what good work is, what hard work is, making sure that recognizing the fullness of human beings and care is part of that good work. So that's the first thing that I want to say. And then, when you think about, I think there's so much fear because there's so much that's unknown. It's
Mm.
still so new. We don't know really how it's going to change things. You know, Chat GPT, oh my God, like, is that going to really replace people's jobs? We don't know. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. And with uncertainty comes fear. And sometimes we react too quickly. What I would say is, when you look at the history of how technology has changed things over time, it's true that it has always destroyed jobs. It is always like, we don't have buggy whips anymore. It has destroyed some jobs, but it has always created new jobs. It has always taken us to a different level. There have been economists that have, like David Otter and Claudia Golden, and a number of people who've written about this before, that say at the turn of the last century, when so much of the workforce was on the farm, the family farm, people could see that with tractors and technology and all of this new stuff, they weren't going to need as much manual labor on the farm anymore. So they wouldn't have something for their kids.
Mm.
They wouldn't have a path for them. And so in the Midwest, they got together and they thought, well, what's the next best thing? What can we do? They got together and they thought, we need to get them educated. They need to go to high school, and became the high school movement. And they began to invest in public education and making sure that they had a really highly educated workforce. That then became, in the 1940s, the workforce that ended up helping the United States, help win the Second World War. We had the most educated workforce in the world at that point.
Right.
So I think that we need to be thinking bigger about these challenges, not just like, how am I going to train up, or how am I going to use AI, and what's it going to mean for my company? Absolutely, we need to be thinking about that. But also think about, well, what are some of the larger social trends that we need to be thinking about? What can I, as a business, do to kind of like help move our entire country into a better place? If we're going to have so many fewer jobs, what are we going to do with the people? We have a pretty crappy safety net right now. What do we do?
Yeah.
What's the human future? And what is my role as a business leader, thinking about kind of some of my role in advocating? If I'm not, if I'm not able to get somebody their health insurance, do we want a whole bunch of people who have no health insurance and no access to any kind of health care? And what's that going to mean? Are we going to have a society of have and have nots? What's my role as a business leader in trying to advocate for not only the best case for my organization, but how I fit into this larger whole? I would really encourage people to think about that.
Great. Thank you, Brigid. So as we kind of summarize our discussion today, there's a couple things. I mean, what are the first actions leaders should take to, one, de-stress their organization so they can retain their top performers, create an environment that attracts the best talent, and then also just motivate their people overall to feel good and do their best work? What are the top things that leaders should be thinking about?
I go back to history on this one. One of the books that I read that was very influential as I was writing my book, it's a book called The Story of Work. It's the history of work from the dawn of the prehistoric ages for human beings, by a Dutch historian named Jan Lucassen.
Hmm.
And one of the things that he said is that throughout human history, good work has always been defined by three principles: meaning, fairness, and cooperation. And I think if you can keep those three things in mind, are you creating meaning? Is there fairness? Are you making decisions that people trust? And cooperating, remembering that we all need to work together. That when you have kind of these top-down command and control cultures, they're incredibly punishing. Only certain people are going to rise. If that's the organization that you want to create and foster, then you recognize that you could be on a tightrope. People might abandon you unless you pay them a top dollar. But if you really want people invested in you and your purpose, and why you're there, really be thinking about how meaning, fairness, and cooperation in what you're doing.
Great. Thank you for that. So before we wrap up here, I would love to learn a little bit more about the important work you're doing at the Better Life Lab. Could you kind of dive into that?
Sure. Yes. So at the Better Life Lab, we're one of a number of programs at a think tank called New America. And what we're all, what we're all looking at is how can we renew the promise um, of America, of the best that we can be. And so, what we focus on at the Better Life Lab is that question, like, how do we make a good life more available, more equitable, more fair? So we do what we call it work family justice. How can we really have the systems, the workplace practices, the public policies, the cultural norms that help people combine meaningful work and time for their lives and care? How can we elevate the value of paid and unpaid care work? Paid care workers, the child care workers, home care workers, they perform such a vital role. And we found that, especially in the pandemic, people could not work without childcare.
Hmm.
And yet these workers are paid really poverty wages. So how can we increase that value? And unpaid care work that mainly women do, they spend 2 times the amount that men do. How can we bring more equity, and how can we bring more sharing into that kind of elevating the value of care? Um, and then we look at gender equity, really equity across race, class, and gender. And how we work is we do a lot of journalism and research and thought leadership, narrative change work. For we've done work with behavioral scientists, and we do have some workshops that we give about how to create sort of workplaces that can be both productive and cultures of equity and trust. So that's a lot of the work that we do. So I encourage you to go to our website. We have a newsletter, subscribe to it, be in touch with us. We're constantly looking at how we can look at moving public policy, workplace practice, and cultural norms.
Great. Well, Brigid, I just want to thank you for such a wonderful conversation today. I know that I've learned so much from you, and I really appreciate you sharing your time with us today.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful and look forward to continuing to work on all of these things.
Yes, great. Well, thank you all that have joined in on the People Strategy Forum. We'll see you next week.